Since the passing of legal segregation from the ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, it was decided that children of different colors would be taught in different schools under the assumption that they would be separate but equal. Oliver Brown, the parent of one of the African American children that had to walk very far to get to her school, began to argue that the schools for blacks and the schools for whites were not and couldn't ever be equal as long as they were separate, and that the action itself violated the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. This ruling occurred because it finally came to light that separate but equal was actually inherently unequal, and African Americans wanted and deserved the same standard of education as white people.
Oliver appealed to the federal court, who denied him, saying that the schools were equal enough to make no action, so he appealed to the Supreme Court. A few people involved in making the decision for the Supreme Court were Thurgood Marshall, a part of the plaintiff and soon-to-be first black justice of the court, as well as Chief Justice Earl Warren. They came to the unanimous conclusion that separate but equal was unconstitutional and asserted that the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal education. Most of these cases came about due to segregated schools that were not equal in quality of education, transportation to black schools becoming risks to students, some saying that the death of Supreme Court Justice Frederick Vinson in 1953 and the appointment of Earl Warren had set the stage for the unanimous decision in the case of Brown versus Board Education, that cases had been held to desegregate the U.S., but most failed and were told that if the same opportunities were offered, then it was separate but equal. And one woman named Esther Brown, a Jewish woman, who saw the injustice in black schools and raised tensions trying to have Oliver Brown, who was not related, sue the Board of Education for lack of equality between schools. The case can be traced back to Plessy versus Ferguson when they decided that African Americans deserved a separate but equal lifestyle, including education, despite it never being mentioned in the 14th Amendment. After years of this legal segregation, Oliver Brown decided that he had had enough of the ruling and appealed to the federal court and consequently the Supreme Court.
In the main case of Brown versus Board of Education, 13 parents took their children to schools for white kids and tried to enroll their children and were sent away. So, Oliver Brown, one of the parents, filed a suit against the school board that was dismissed by the federal court but actually picked up and reviewed by the Supreme Court. That ended in the ruling that separate was not equal.
Integrated schools seemed like an impossible pipe dream, except to the Brown family.
Somebody had to start it, my father said. Somebody had to take a stand. I remember that my father took me by the hand and we walked together to Sumner School. My father tried to enroll me in the school for the next year, and they told him that I couldn't go there because I was a Negro. Then he asked to see the principal.
When the Reverend Oliver Brown returned home that day, he was extremely angry. His simple request had been denied. He also knew he had to do something dramatic if changes were to take place. So, he went to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, for assistance. They filed a lawsuit in Topeka in order to seek action through the court on the principle that educational facilities for black children were inadequate.
Oliver Brown was the man that appealed to the Supreme Court and who saw the entire thing through with the help of the members of the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall and Earl Warren and the other justices who determined that the ruling wasn't fair made it clear that separate but equal was unconstitutional.
Brown appealed to the federal court, who denied him the change, having decided that it wasn't a problem, and so he appealed to the Supreme Court. The justices of the Supreme Court looked at the facts of the matter that separate but equal was, at nature, very unequal, and that the white lifestyle was privileged and led mostly to success, whereas the black lifestyle at their separate schools led to less successful lives as well as instilled a sense of inferiority among them. The right to education should be extended to all people, despite the color of skin, and so they unanimously voted that the separate but equal ruling was ridiculous.
As it was around the country, white children and black children were all taken to different schools and given different standards of education. So this Supreme Court ruling, which ruled over the entire country, made the decision that having the children go to separate schools was unconstitutional, and thus kids of all color were permitted to go to a singular school in their districts and given the same standard of education. This ruling also proved a major landmark in the civil rights movement because it showed the change was happening and the idea of separate but equal was becoming more and more out of date.
To this day, kids of any race are allowed to go to any school they want and be given the same standard of education as each other. It significantly helped in the civil rights movement in trying to instill a sense of tolerance and acceptance among all Americans to ensure that everyone was equal. While this country still faces racism today, more severe in some areas than others, Brown v. Board of Education is still a major landmark from the civil rights, as it has been proven that separate but equal was unconstitutional.
There were 5 cases involved in the Brown v. Board of Education case: Belton v. Gebhardt, Boiling v. Sharp, Brown v. Board of Education, Briggs v. Elliott, Davis v. County School Board. Belton v. Gebhardt was all about how the parents of Claymont were very upset about their children's lack of transportation to the school. The parents started a petition due to the fact that 2 white school buses passed directly by their area and refused to let their children get picked up. Many of the parents wanted their children to attend the white school because it was close to their neighborhood, but they were denied, causing the kids to walk through bad areas and long distances to get to school. 11 children were admitted to the school on the state level, but the case continued to the federal court as one of the cases represented in the Brown v. Board of Education case.
In Briggs v. Elliott, parents in South Carolina approached the schools requesting a bus transportation for black students as they did for white students. When this was turned down, the group went for a case against segregation itself. Reverend J. A. Delane, the school principal, then recruited parents and representatives of the NAACP to support their case. The court denied the request of desegregation of public schools and began trying equalization. Resulting from the case, many of the leading participants lost their jobs. In the Boiling v. Sharp case, 11 students were wanting to be admitted to a white junior high school and were denied due to the thought that desegregation was going to be dangerous for the students. There were classrooms empty in the school, which then caused the parents to take action. An attorney was hired, and before the case went to court, they were approached and asked to be a part of the Brown v. Board of Education cases.
In the last case, Davis v. County School Board, in April of 1951, Barbara Rose John started a strike against the school and the school board with her fellow students to get them to recognize how bad the conditions of the school were, as they had no gymnasium or infirmary, only 3 buses, and decrepit buildings. This recognition would also prove that the school, which was separate from the other schools for white kids, was not equal and didn't provide for very good educational environments. A lawsuit was filed on the students' behalf against the school board, but the ruling was found that the conditions weren't considered unequal to that of the white child's experience and caused no harm. When desegregation was finally ruled, white Virginians ordered a massive counteract that effectively closed the school system for 5 years. The Brown v. Board of Education cases resulted in a great change of the civil rights movement and affected many of the segregation policies in public schooling.